The world of kings and queens is never quite what we imagine it to be. We picture the crown, the throne, the sweeping gowns, and the glittering jewels, and we assume that everything surrounding a monarch must have been grand and effortless and touched by some quality ordinary life could never possess. But the truth, the real truth buried beneath centuries of portraits and poetry and polished legend, is that even the most powerful ruler who ever lived still had to eat breakfast, still had to sit down at the end of a long day and reach for something warm and familiar and comforting, the same way any of us might after hours spent carrying a weight we never asked for but could not put down. And it is in that ordinary, deeply human act of simply eating a meal that we sometimes find the most revealing portrait of a person history has otherwise armored in mythology. Tonight we are going to step inside a world almost nobody ever got to see. Not the grand public stage of Elizabeth I of England, not the famous speeches or the diplomatic triumphs or the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but the private, hidden, endlessly fascinating world of what it actually took to feed her. Every single day, from the fires lit before dawn to the quiet clearing of her table long after dark. From the locked room, where spices worth more than most families earned in a lifetime sat under careful guard, to the small private chamber where a woman who ruled the most powerful nation on earth sat alone with a dish of stewed pears and, for a few brief minutes, stopped being a queen and simply became a person who was hungry. This is a story about food, yes, but it is also a story about power and trust and the invisible army of people whose names history never bothered to record. People who spent their entire lives making certain that one woman's every meal arrived exactly right, every single time, without ever being thanked or even truly noticed. It is a story about what abundance looks like when it surrounds a person who barely touches it, and what that gap between what is prepared and what is consumed tells us about a world built on appearances so carefully maintained that even dinner became a form of diplomacy. And I think, by the time we reach the end of this journey together, you will never look at a simple meal quite the same way again. Let us begin where every day in an English royal palace truly began, not with the queen, not with the courtiers, not with anyone whose name you would recognize from a history book, but with a man standing alone in a dark kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning in the summer of 1590, his arms dusted white to the elbows with flour, his back already aching from work that started before most of the palace had even stirred in their beds. The ovens behind him have been burning for 2 hours already. Not because anyone has asked for bread yet, not at this hour, but because bread made properly, bread worthy of a queen's table, cannot be rushed. It needs time. It needs heat that has built slowly and evenly through thick stone walls until the oven itself becomes a kind of living thing, radiating warmth so steady and so consistent that the dough placed inside it will rise and brown and develop exactly the crust it is supposed to have. Not a shade too pale, not a shade too dark. And this man, whose name no surviving record preserves for us, knows this the way he knows how to breathe. His hands have shaped this dough thousands of times. He does not need a scale to tell him when a loaf weighs what it should. He does not need a clock to tell him when the dough has proofed long enough. He feels it. The slight give beneath his palms when the dough is ready. The faint tackiness that means it needs another few minutes and not a second more. The particular weight of a properly shaped loaf settling into his hands with a rightness that no written recipe could ever fully teach, because this kind of knowledge lives in the body, not on the page, and it is passed from one baker to the next through years of standing side by side in the heat, watching, copying, failing, adjusting, until the work becomes so deeply learned it no longer requires conscious thought at all. The fire he works beside has been fed since well before dawn with wood selected specifically for this purpose, chosen for how evenly it burns, how cleanly it heats, and the room around him smells of wood smoke and warm flour and the faint, sharp sourness of yeast that has been kept alive for longer than anyone in this kitchen can quite remember. Somewhere in a covered crock near the hearth sits the starter, a living culture of wild yeast carefully maintained generation after generation, fed with fresh flour and water at regular intervals, treated with the same attentive care you might give a small, fragile animal whose survival depended entirely on your consistency. If the starter died, if someone forgot to feed it, if the temperature in the room shifted too dramatically during the night and killed the culture, the household would not simply lose a convenient ingredient. It would lose years of accumulated character, the particular flavor and rising power that this specific culture had developed over time, and replacing it would mean starting from nothing and waiting weeks or months before the new starter matured enough to produce bread worthy of the standard this kitchen demanded. Here is the first thing that tends to surprise people about what it actually took to feed Elizabeth Tudor on an ordinary day. And I want you to sit with this because it shapes everything else we are going to explore tonight. Not a banquet day. Not a day when a foreign ambassador arrived expecting to be dazzled. Not Christmas or Easter or any of the grand occasions when the kitchen's full theatrical ambition was unleashed. Just an ordinary Tuesday in her own rooms, with no one watching, no one to impress, nothing at stake except the quiet daily business of keeping a queen fed. The kitchens working that morning were not preparing one meal. They were preparing dozens of dishes, sometimes more than anyone could comfortably count, and Elizabeth herself might taste 4 or 5 of them briefly before turning her attention to something else entirely. The rest of the food, all that effort, all those hours of careful preparation, went to her household, to her ladies-in-waiting, to the officers and gentlemen and minor functionaries who kept the enormous machinery of her court running day after day. And some of it, honestly, went nowhere at all. It was quietly cleared away by servants who had learned through long experience not to ask questions about waste in a household where waste was, in its own strange and deeply calculated way, a form of power. Because abundance, visible, undeniable, almost aggressive abundance, said something about a monarch's strength and resources that restraint never could. A table groaning under more food than any single person could possibly consume was not a failure of planning. It was a statement, a declaration made fresh every single day that this household, this queen, this kingdom had more than enough, that there was no scarcity here, that whatever challenges England faced beyond the palace walls, within these rooms at least, there was plenty and to spare. That is the shape of this story, really. Abundance built deliberately, almost architecturally, around a woman who by most accounts that have survived her actually ate rather modestly. And somewhere in the gap between what was prepared and what was consumed, in that vast, strange space between the mountain of food that left those kitchens every day and the few small portions Elizabeth actually put in her mouth, lived an entire world of servants and cooks and tasters and quiet observers who saw a version of the queen that almost no one else in England ever got to see. They saw her reach for bread when she was hungry. They saw her push a dish aside when her stomach was troubling her. They saw her eat stewed pears with a pleasure so genuine and so unguarded it looked nothing like the careful, practiced grace she showed at public feasts. They knew her appetite, her preferences, her small private comforts, with an intimacy that no ambassador or courtier or even most of her closest political advisors could ever claim. And yet they remained, almost without exception, invisible to the historical record. Their knowledge died with them, carried to their graves and memories that no one thought important enough to write down. I find that gap genuinely fascinating, between what was known and what was recorded, between who mattered in the moment and who mattered to history, between the public performance of a queen's dinner and the private reality of a woman simply eating her supper. And tonight I want to walk you through all of it, kitchen by kitchen, tray by tray, corridor by corridor, all the way to the small private table where Elizabeth actually sat down to eat. Let us start with the bread, because bread in this world was never just bread. A queen's bread was not one bread. There were grades, carefully distinguished, and the grade of bread a person received told you almost everything you needed to know about where they stood in the invisible but absolutely rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of life in this palace. At the top, reserved for Elizabeth's own table and for the very highest members of her household, was a fine white loaf called a manchet. It was made from the most carefully bolted flour available, flour that had been sifted again and again through progressively finer cloths until only the palest, softest, most refined powder remained. Everything coarser, everything darker, everything that carried the heavier flavor and rougher texture of the whole grain, was separated out and sent elsewhere, down the hierarchy, to be baked into the bread that fed people whose rank did not entitle them to the queen's own loaf. The manchet itself, when it came out of the oven properly made, was soft and pale and almost startlingly light, with a tender crumb and a thin, golden crust that broke cleanly when you tore it. It was, in every sense, a luxury. A loaf that used more flour per finished product than the coarser versions, because so much of the grain had been discarded in the sifting process, and that higher cost, that deliberate wastefulness built into the very method of its making, was part of the point. Below the manchet sat a whole descending scale of increasingly coarse bread, each grade a little darker, a little heavier, a little less refined than the one above it, until you reached the plain, rough loaves eaten by the lowest servants in the household, bread made from flour that had barely been sifted at all, dense and dark and filling in a way the manchet never needed to be, because the people eating it were not looking for delicacy. They were looking for something that would sit heavy in the stomach and carry them through a long day of physical labor in kitchens and corridors and stables where the queen's own bread was as distant and unreachable as the queen herself. If you had stood in the bakehouse that morning and watched the man shaping the manchet dough this particular morning works near a fire that throws shifting orange light across his hands and forearms, and the sound around him is the particular sound of a working bakehouse in the hours before dawn, a low, rhythmic thudding of dough being folded and turned against a floured surface, the occasional crack and hiss of a log shifting in the fire, the distant clatter of someone in another room stacking cooling racks or sliding a peel into the back of an oven to retrieve a finished loaf. He does not think of this work as glamorous, and it is not, but he carries within him a quiet pride that comes from doing something difficult extremely well, day after day, year after year, without recognition, without applause, without anyone above him in the household ever pausing to acknowledge that the bread they reach for so casually at the queen's own table exists only because he was here, in this heat, at this hour, doing exactly this. Behind him, through an archway into a second chamber that stays slightly cooler than the main bakehouse, someone else is already working with pastry that will not be eaten by anyone for another 8 hours. Pastry in a royal kitchen of this era was not the simple, utilitarian thing we might now, through a different doorway, into a room adjacent to the bakehouse, but separated enough that the heat from the bread ovens did not interfere with the more delicate work happening here. A woman is straining honey through a length of fine cloth into a wide ceramic bowl. The sound of this is almost nothing. A slow, thick drip that she alone can really hear over the general noise of the surrounding kitchen. A sound so quiet and so patient it seems to belong to a different world entirely from the roaring fires and the heavy thud of dough being worked a few yards away. Honey was one of the older sweeteners available in England, used for centuries before sugar became widely available, and it still held an important place in the royal kitchen even as sugar increasingly took over the more prestigious and expensive role of sweetening dishes destined for the very highest tables. Honey went into simpler preparations, into drinks, into remedies, into the everyday cooking that kept the broader household fed, while sugar, that far more costly and far more symbolically charged ingredient, was reserved for the dishes where its presence would be noticed and appreciated by the people who mattered most. And this brings us to something I want to spend real time on, because it surprises a great many people when they hear it for the first time, and it connects deeply to nearly everything else we are going to explore tonight. Sugar in Elizabeth's England was not the everyday, taken for granted commodity we know now. It was extraordinarily expensive. It arrived in England after a journey that might have taken months, imported from Mediterranean sources, and increasingly from the Atlantic world, shipped across unpredictable seas in casks and barrels, and refined through a laborious process in a hard, dense cones called sugar loaves that could weigh several pounds each. These cones were so hard, so compacted by the refining process, that they could not simply be scooped or poured the way we use sugar today. They had to be broken apart with a special tool, a kind of heavy iron implement designed specifically for this purpose, chipped and cracked, and then ground or pounded into whatever degree of fineness a particular recipe required. The effort involved in simply preparing sugar for use, before you even began cooking with it, tells you something about how precious this substance was considered. You did not waste it. You did not use it carelessly. Every grain of sugar that went into a dish represented real expenditure, and a household that used sugar liberally and visibly was making a statement about its wealth as clearly as if it had hung gold cloth on the walls. A household that used a great deal of sugar was announcing something about itself to everyone who sat at its table. And Elizabeth, by every account that survives from those who served her, loved sugar. This was not a secret, exactly, but it was understood most intimately by the small circle of people who prepared and served her private meals. Sweet meats, candied fruits, sugared wafers, marzipan worked into elaborate shapes and painted with edible colors. All of these held a genuine appeal for her that went beyond mere politeness or ceremonial acceptance. She reached for sweet things the way a person reaches for something they actually want, not because custom demanded it, not because refusing would cause offense, but because she genuinely liked the taste of sugar on her tongue. Her fondness for it was well known inside her own household, whispered about a little further out among courtiers who had observed her at table closely enough to notice the pattern, and would eventually, later in her reign, become something that foreign visitors quietly noted when they had the chance to observe her up close and reported home in their diplomatic correspondence with a mixture of fascination and faintly concealed judgment. We will come back to this later, because it connects to something I think you will find genuinely touching about a woman who ruled the most powerful country in the world and still, in her own private moments, reached for something sweet the way any of us might at the end of a difficult day. There is a humanity in that small gesture that no portrait or official record ever quite captures, and it lived, as so much of this story does, almost exclusively in the memories of the people who watched her eat and knew her preferences well enough to anticipate them before she had to ask. For now, back to the kitchen, because there is a great deal more happening in these rooms before the sun is even fully up, and I want you to see it the way a person moving through this space would have experienced it. The heat, the noise, the sheer relentless physical reality of a working kitchen operating at this scale. This boy is not thinking about Elizabeth. Not really. He is not imagining the moment this joint of beef finally reaches the queen's table, carved thin and arranged on silver plate. He is thinking about his arm, which aches with a deep, dull persistence that he has learned to push to the back of his mind but can never quite ignore entirely. He is thinking about breakfast, which he has not had yet, and will not get for some time still, because the kitchen staff eats after the work is done, not before, and his particular work this morning is far from finished. He is thinking, in the vague, half-formed way that a 14-year-old thinks about anything, about whether the head cook will notice if he lets the fire die down just slightly, just enough to make the heat a fraction less punishing, just enough to give his aching arm a few minutes of slightly easier turning before building the flames back up again. He will not risk it. The head cook notices everything. This is a man, the head cook, whose authority within the kitchen is absolute and whose standards are maintained not through cruelty, exactly, but through a kind of relentless, watchful competence that makes everyone around him sharply aware of their own performance at all times. A fire allowed to die down at the wrong moment produces meat that cooks unevenly, that develops a crust too quickly on one side, while remaining underdone on the other, and meat that arrives at the queen's table anything less than perfectly roasted reflects on every single person in this kitchen, from the boy turning the spit to the head cook who oversaw the preparation. In a kitchen serving an ordinary household, a slightly uneven roast might pass without comment. In a kitchen serving Elizabeth Tudor, it would not. This, I think, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures something essential about the world we are moving through tonight. We tend to imagine royal kitchens as grand, ceremonial spaces, full of purpose and reverence, places where every person working understood the historic significance of what they were doing and felt honored by their proximity to the crown. The reality was considerably more mundane. Mostly they were just kitchens. Hot, loud, physically exhausting places full of tired people doing repetitive work under enormous pressure. The same as any kitchen anywhere, any restaurant kitchen, any institutional kitchen, except that the stakes if something went wrong were considerably higher than in an ordinary house. A mistake in a common kitchen meant a bad meal. A mistake here, depending on what went wrong and who noticed, could mean the end of a career, the loss of a position that supported an entire family, or in the very worst and rarest cases, consequences considerably more severe than simple unemployment. The boy at the spit does not think about these larger stakes. He thinks about his arm, and about breakfast, and about the endless, mesmerizing dance of fat dripping from the slowly turning meat into the coals below, each drop producing a tiny flare of flame and a wisp of smoke that rises and vanishes into the general haze hanging permanently beneath the kitchen ceiling. He has been doing this job for 2 years now, long enough that the novelty of working in a royal palace has worn off entirely, and what remains is simply the work itself, heavy, hot, repetitive, and necessary, the invisible foundation upon which all the glamour and spectacle and diplomatic theater of a royal table ultimately rested. Let us leave him for a moment and move deeper into the working complex of rooms that together made up the royal kitchens, because there is a smaller chamber tucked just off the main cooking spaces that most of the staff refer to simply as the spicery. And it is here that some of the most expensive ingredients in the entire palace are kept under lock and key. The door to this room is not large or particularly impressive to look at. A person passing through the corridor outside might walk past it without a second glance, not realizing that behind that plain wooden door sat a collection of ingredients worth more, ounce for ounce, than almost anything else in the building. Cinnamon bark, rolled into tight quills, its surface rough and woody on the outside but releasing, when broken, a fragrance so warm and so immediately recognizable that even now, for centuries later, it remains one of the most beloved scents in the world. Whole nutmeg, still wrapped in its lacy outer covering of mace, each nut representing a tree that grew on islands so remote that most of the kitchen staff could not have pointed to them on a map if their lives depended on it. Cloves, small and dark and impossibly pungent, their oil so concentrated that a single clove could flavor an entire dish, each one the dried flower bud of a tree that grew only in a handful of places on the other side of the world. And black pepper, the most common of these extraordinary ingredients, measured out grain by grain because it was worth, ounce for ounce, something startlingly close to the value of silver. A clerk kept a careful written record of what left this room and what did not, because spices of this kind did not simply run out and get reordered the way flour or butter or ale could be. They arrived on ships after months at sea, passing through the hands of merchants in half a dozen ports along routes that stretched from the islands of Southeast Asia through the Indian Ocean, around the coast of Africa, or overland through the Middle East, into the great trading cities of the Mediterranean, and finally northward to England. Every grain of pepper that went missing from this room, every stick of cinnamon unaccounted for in the clerk's ledger, was in a very real sense money walking out the door, and the household took this accounting seriously enough that the spicery functioned less like a pantry and more like a small, fragrant treasury. The woman who holds the key to this room in the summer of 1590 has worked in the royal household for nearly 20 years, and she still, if she is honest with herself, feels a small thrill each time she unlocks that door. Not because she intends to steal anything. The thought has genuinely never crossed her mind, and the consequences of being caught would be severe enough to make the temptation academic in any case. The thrill comes from the smell. That first wave of fragrance that greets her when the door swings open, warm and dark and faintly sharp, layered with the distinct signatures of a dozen different spices mingling together in the close air of a small, windowless room. It is a smell unlike anything most people in England will ever encounter in their lives. A smell that carries within it the distant echo of places most of Elizabeth's subjects could not even imagine, of tropical forests and island harbors and ships creaking under the weight of cargo that had traveled farther than any of the people handling it would ever go. Sugar and spice together, in the quantities kept in this one small room, represented more wealth than most of Elizabeth's subjects would see in a lifetime of ordinary work. A laborer earning a few pence a day could work for years without accumulating the value contained in a single shelf of this spicery. And yet here it sat, behind a plain door in a corridor most people in the palace had no reason to walk through, guarded not by soldiers, but by a middle-aged woman with a key and a clerk with a ledger, waiting patiently to be measured out in careful portions and carried into the kitchens where it would transform simple ingredients, meat, fruit, pastry, cream, into something extraordinary. She measures out cinnamon this morning, breaking a quill carefully and grinding a portion of it into a coarse powder using a small mortar she keeps in the room for exactly this purpose. Alongside it, she weighs a careful portion of sugar, chipped from one of the hard cones stored on a separate shelf, and then ground into finer crystals before being added to a ceramic jar that she seals and labels and sets aside for the cook who will use it later that day. These ingredients are destined for a dish of stewed pears that will be served, if all goes well, at the Queen's own table that evening. Pears simmered slowly in a mixture of sugar and water, scented with cinnamon and perhaps a touch of something else, a little ginger, a whisper of clove, cooked until the fruit turns soft and almost translucent and the liquid in the pot thickens into a light, fragrant syrup that pools around each pear like something halfway between sauce and perfume. Stewed fruit, gently spiced, was a genuine favorite of Elizabeth's, according to those who were close enough to notice such things and whose observations survived in the scattered, fragmentary sources that historians piece together with such painstaking care. And it says something rather lovely, I think, something worth holding on to as we move through the rest of this story, that a woman who commanded armies and outmaneuvered the most powerful kings and diplomats in Europe, who held together a kingdom riven by religious conflict and foreign threat through decades of almost impossibly skillful governance, still had a particular fondness for something as simple and as comforting as fruit cooked soft with a little sugar and spice. There is a warmth in that detail, a humanity, that no formal portrait or official biography ever quite manages to convey. It reminds us, in a way that I think we sometimes need to be reminded, that even the most extraordinary people in history were still, underneath everything, people. People who got tired. People who got hungry. People who reached for something sweet at the end of a long day because it made them feel, for just a moment, a little less burdened by the weight of everything they carried. Let us leave the spicery now and walk further down the corridor, past the ovens still radiating their steady heat, past the roasting fires where our young spit turner continues his endless turning, past the pastry room and the honey straining station and the 100 other small centers of activity that together make up this enormous, complex, endlessly busy working organism that was a royal kitchen in full operation. The corridor narrows slightly here, and the air changes. Less heat, more damp, and ahead a doorway that most people in the palace are simply not permitted to walk through. There is no guard standing outside it, not at this hour, but everyone who works in this part of the building knows which doors they may open and which they may not. And this particular door belongs to a category of spaces that exists specifically to manage a danger so serious and so persistent that the entire architecture of how royal food moved through a palace had been built, over centuries, to address it. Poison was not an abstract fear in Elizabeth's world. It was not a dramatic plot device borrowed from novels or plays, though playwrights of her era certainly made use of it often enough. It was a documented, historically real anxiety that shaped the daily life of monarchs across Europe and had done so for centuries. Kings and queens had been poisoned, or at the very least, enough of them had sickened under circumstances suspicious enough that no royal household could afford to dismiss the possibility entirely, regardless of how unlikely any individual attempt might actually be. Elizabeth herself, a Protestant queen excommunicated by the Pope, targeted by Catholic conspiracies real and imagined throughout her reign, had more reason than most to take the threat seriously. And her household, reflecting this reality, maintained an entire quiet system of precautions built specifically around the fear that something dangerous might find its way into the food before it reached her. The system was not dramatic. It did not involve elaborate laboratories or teams of physicians analyzing every dish with scientific instruments. It was, in practice, considerably simpler and considerably more human than that. Certain trusted servants, often called tasters or assayers depending on the period and the specific household, were responsible for sampling dishes before they reached anyone of real importance. And this was not a ceremonial gesture performed for show, not a symbolic nod to tradition that everyone understood was merely decorative. It was taken with genuine seriousness by the people whose job it was, because their job, stripped to its most essential reality, consisted of putting food into their own mouths that might, however improbably, contain something designed to kill the person it was ultimately intended for. A man standing near that restricted doorway this morning has held this particular role for several years now. He does not think of himself as brave, particularly. He has never used that word about himself, and would likely dismiss it with mild embarrassment if someone else applied it to him. He does his job. He tastes what he is given to taste. He waits the appropriate interval, noting any unusual sensation, any flavor or texture or aftertaste that does not match what he would expect from the dish in question. And then, if everything seems as it should, he nods once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and steps back to let the dish continue on its journey toward the queen's private rooms. That nod, that tiny movement of his head, performed dozens of times a day, every day, throughout years of unbroken service, is one of the most quietly remarkable things happening in this entire palace. It means the food is safe. It means he has placed his own body between a queen and the possibility of harm, and found nothing. It means the system, for another meal, for another day, has worked. And it happens so smoothly, so routinely, so invisibly, that almost no one watching it would recognize it as anything remarkable at all. He tastes a spoonful from a dish of pottage this morning, a thick, savory mixture that will be served to members of the household further down the hierarchy before any of the grander dishes destined for Elizabeth's own table are ready. The flavor is familiar. He has tasted variations on this pottage hundreds of times. The grains, the herbs, the underlying richness of stock made from bones that simmered through much of the previous day. Everything tastes exactly as it should. He waits. He nods. He steps back. The dish moves on. And the whole thing, from spoonful to nod, has taken perhaps 15 seconds, a quarter of a minute devoted to a precaution that exists because somewhere in the long, tangled, occasionally violent history of European monarchy, enough people decided that killing a ruler through their dinner was a viable strategy that every ruler afterward had to take the possibility seriously, whether they personally believed anyone was actually trying to poison them on any given Tuesday morning or not. I find something strangely moving in this. An entire hidden structure of trust and risk built around the simple act of a woman sitting down to eat her dinner. A man whose name history does not preserve, performing an act of quiet, unrecognized courage dozens of times a day, every day, for years, and never once finding the danger he was there to intercept. Does that mean the danger was never real? Or does it mean that his presence, and the presence of every taster before him stretching back through generations, was itself enough to deter any attempt? He does not know. He has stopped trying to work it out. He simply tastes, waits, nods, and moves on to the next dish, the next meal, the next day, carrying a responsibility so thoroughly absorbed into the routine of his daily life that it has long since ceased to feel extraordinary, even though, by any reasonable measure, it is. Beyond the tasting area, the palace's architecture shifts again. A narrow stone stairway leads downward, away from the heat and noise of the kitchens above, and the air changes almost immediately, growing cooler, damper, carrying the mineral smell of stone that has never quite dried out, stone that has been underground and away from direct sunlight for so long that it has taken on a permanent, faintly slick dampness, cold to the touch even in the warmest months of summer. This is where the wine lives. Casks from France, from Spain, from the vineyards along the Rhine, stacked in careful rows in a cellar whose temperature remains naturally and conveniently stable throughout the year, cool enough to keep the wine from spoiling in summer, protected enough from the worst cold to prevent it from freezing in winter. A cellarer, a man whose entire professional existence revolves around the contents of these casks, keeps a ledger with something close to religious devotion. Every cask that enters this room is recorded. Every draw of wine taken from a cask is noted, dated, attributed to the meal or the occasion it was intended for. This is not mere bookkeeping. This is accountability, because wine of this quality, imported at this expense, represented a significant portion of the household's budget, and a cellarer who could not account precisely for what had been consumed and what remained would not hold his position for very long. Elizabeth herself, by most accounts, drank in genuinely modest quantities for a woman of her rank and era. This is worth noting because the drinking habits of Tudor England, particularly among the wealthy and the powerful, tended toward consumption levels that would strike a modern person as startling. Wine and ale were not luxuries. They were daily necessities, consumed at every meal by nearly everyone in the household, partly because the water supply in most English cities and even many country estates was unreliable at best and actively dangerous at worst. Ale brewed on site, using water that had been boiled during the brewing process, and was therefore considerably safer than untreated water drawn from a well or a river, functioned as the ordinary daily drink for the vast majority of the palace staff, consumed the way we might reach for a glass of water today, without any particular sense of occasion or indulgence. Elizabeth, however, favored wine, specifically a light wine cut generously with water, diluted enough that the result was more flavored water than proper wine by the standards of a serious drinker. This preference, small as it seems, tells us something genuine about her relationship with control. A queen who needed her wits about her at every moment of every day, who could not afford the luxury of a foggy head or a loosened tongue even in the relative privacy of her own rooms, found in watered wine a compromise that allowed her to participate in the social ritual of drinking without ever surrendering the mental clarity she depended on for her political survival. The household around her, it should be said, showed no such restraint. Officers, courtiers, gentlemen of the household, and the vast army of lower servants all consumed quantities of ale and wine that the household accounts record with meticulous, occasionally alarming precision. The sheer volume of ale brewed on the palace grounds alone, gallons upon gallons produced every week by a brewing operation that functioned essentially as a small industrial enterprise embedded within the household, gives you a sense of just how central alcohol was to the daily functioning of this world. Not as recreation, not primarily, but as simple, essential hydration consumed by hundreds of people every single day. Further along the underground corridor, in a room kept even cooler than the wine cellar by virtue of its position deeper within the earth and further from any source of heat, sits row upon row of ceramic jars. These contain preserved fruit, cherries and damsons and plums put up in sugar syrup months earlier, sealed carefully and stored here in the dark and the cold, waiting patiently for a moment when fresh fruit was out of season and something sweet was still required. Preservation in this world was not a convenience. It was not a hobby or a pleasant domestic skill practiced by people with time on their hands. It was a genuine, essential craft practiced with enormous care, because a household that ran out of preserved fruit in the depths of winter, when fresh fruit simply did not exist at any price, had very few good alternatives. A poorly sealed jar could spoil its contents within weeks. Fruit preserved with too little sugar might ferment or go sour. Fruit preserved with too much might become so cloyingly sweet that it was unpleasant to eat. A young woman moves between the wine casks and the fruit jars with a small lamp whose flame barely reaches the edges of the room, checking seals on the ceramic jars, running a careful eye over anything that looks even slightly amiss, a lid that seems to have shifted, a seal that might not be quite as tight as it should be, a jar whose contents have taken on a color or a cloudiness that suggests something has gone wrong inside. She makes mental notes as she goes, filing away details she will report to whoever oversees this part of the household's operations, and she pauses for a moment near a jar of candied orange peel that arrived only recently, imported at considerable expense from somewhere far warmer than England, and she simply looks at it. Orange trees did not grow in England, would not grow in England, not outdoors, not reliably, for centuries still to come. Every piece of that candied peel had traveled an enormous distance to end up in a cool stone room beneath a palace, waiting for a night when someone decided the queen might enjoy something bright and citrus and sweet after a long day of audiences and correspondence and the endless, grinding work of governing a kingdom that never quite stopped demanding her attention. The young woman looking at this jar probably does not think about any of this in quite these terms. She sees an expensive ingredient, carefully stored, waiting its turn. But there is, whether she recognizes it or not, an entire world condensed into that single jar. Ships and merchants and sailors and distant groves of trees bearing fruit in Mediterranean sunlight, all of it converging through an unimaginably complex chain of trade and transport and preservation on this one small room beneath an English palace, so that a queen might, if the mood struck her, taste something bright and unfamiliar on a cold winter evening. Upstairs again now, and the palace has begun to change around the food as it moves away from the kitchens and toward the rooms where it will actually be consumed. What started as a chaotic, sweating, noisy process of raw cooking, all fire and shouting and the heavy physical labor of lifting pots and turning spits and kneading dough, gives way now to something more formal, more hushed, more deliberate, as dishes are transferred from working trays and plain cooking vessels on a silver plate, covered with domed lids that serve two purposes simultaneously. They keep the food warm during the journey from kitchen to table, A journey that in a palace of this size might involve several minutes of walking through corridors and up staircases. And they keep the food hidden from casual eyes, because a covered dish is a small kind of secret, a private matter between the kitchen that prepared it and the person who will eventually lift that lid and see what is inside. A servant carrying one of these covered dishes walks a very particular route through the palace, a route that has been established by long tradition and is not varied casually. The path has been walked so many times, by so many pairs of feet over so many years, that it has worn its own faint track into the stone floor, a shallow groove visible in places where the light catches it at the right angle, a physical record of thousands of meals carried through this exact corridor by people whose individual names no one remembers anymore. Guards stand at certain doorways along this route. Not many, not an army, just enough trusted men, positioned at the right thresholds, to make certain that only servants known to the household, servants whose faces and names are recognized, are permitted to carry food any closer to the queen's private rooms. This was not paranoia exactly. It was ordinary good sense in a world where the person walking through your door with dinner really could, in theory, be an instrument of someone else's ambition, and where the line between loyalty and betrayal was never quite as fixed as anyone in power would have liked to believe. And so the dish of stewed pears, the manchet bread still faintly warm from the oven, the small portion of roasted meat carved thin and arranged carefully on its silver plate, the wine cut with water and poured into a serving vessel of its own, all of it moves together now, tray after tray, carried by servants whose footsteps have gone quiet and careful, instinctively softened as they approach the private quarters where a different set of rules governs how a person walks and speaks and breathes. Up a final flight of stairs, through a final guarded door, and into a set of rooms considerably smaller and considerably calmer than anything we have seen so far tonight. This is where Elizabeth actually eats. Not in some cavernous great hall with musicians playing in a gallery above and 100 courtiers watching her every bite from long tables stretching away below the dais. Those grand public meals happened too, and we will spend real time on them later tonight, because they were their own extraordinary kind of theater, and the contrast between those performances and what happens in this room could hardly be more stark. This is her private dining. The meals she took mostly among a small circle of trusted ladies and attendants, away from the gaze of the wider court, away from the diplomatic calculations that turned every public meal into a kind of chess game, played with food and gesture instead of words. These rooms are warmed by a modest fire, even on summer evenings, because stone walls hold a chill that a fire in the grate keeps comfortably at bay, and lit by beeswax candles that burn cleaner and brighter and considerably more expensively than the tallow candles used further down the household, tallow being cheaper but producing a greasier flame and a distinctly less pleasant smell. A table has been laid already before Elizabeth's arrival, with a care and precision that reflects years of practice. Linen so fine, so carefully bleached through repeated washing and sunning, that it seems almost to glow in the candlelight, its surface smooth and bright, and without a single visible crease or stain. A single knife sits beside the place where she will sit, because forks were not yet in common use in England at this point in history. The fork would arrive, eventually, as an import from continental Europe, but in 1590 it remained a curiosity rather than a standard piece of table equipment, and most food, even at the highest tables in the kingdom, was managed with fingers, a knife, and a great deal of practiced grace that we would find startling and perhaps a little uncomfortable to watch today. A silver cup stands ready for wine, its surface catching the candlelight in small, shifting points of brightness. And near the head of the table sits a chair that, to modern eyes, looks almost unremarkable, a well-made but not especially ornate piece of furniture, except that everyone in the room understands with total, unspoken clarity who alone is permitted to sit in it, and what it means to stand in the presence of the person who does. A lady waits near the table now, standing quiet and attentive, her hands resting at her sides in a posture that looks natural but has in fact been practiced so many times it has become second nature. She knows exactly how Elizabeth prefers her wine poured. She knows exactly how close the bread should sit to the Queen's hand. She knows which of tonight's dishes Elizabeth is likely to reach for first and which she will barely touch. not because anyone has told her these things explicitly, but because she has spent years of watching and remembering and adjusting her own behavior by fractions so small they are almost invisible, learning to read a woman who rarely stated her preferences directly, but whose preferences, once you had learned to observe them. Or perhaps she is newer to this role. Perhaps she arrived at court only months ago, sent by a family who understood that placing a daughter in the queen's private household was an investment that could shape the family's fortunes for a generation. Perhaps she is still learning these unwritten rules, still watching the more experienced women around her for cues she has not yet memorized, still adjusting to the strange, enclosed, emotionally complicated world of serving a monarch so closely that you see her reach for bread and push aside a dish of meat and sit quietly by a fire in the last hours of the day, looking more tired than any public portrait would ever allow. Either way, she stands now, quiet and ready, because Elizabeth has not yet entered the room, and nothing on this table will be touched until she does. Here is the paradox I want you to sit with for a moment, because it threads through absolutely everything we are going to explore tonight. This table, laid with such extraordinary care, surrounded by servants who have spent the entire day, from before dawn until this quiet evening hour, making certain that everything is exactly right, exists for a woman who, according to nearly every account left behind by people who actually watched her eat, consumed remarkably little of what was placed in front of her. Vast effort, vast expense, vast quantities of food moving through kitchens and corridors and past guards and tasters and officers, all converging on one small woman who might eat a portion of bread, a little stewed fruit, a few bites of meat, and leave the rest largely untouched. Nobody quite knew, watching from the edges of the room, whether this came from genuine physical restraint, from the demands of a body that carried the weight of governing a kingdom and could not always summon appetite at the end of a long day, from simple personal taste, from a deliberate strategy of self-control practiced by a woman who understood better than almost anyone alive that her body was never entirely her own, or from something else entirely that Elizabeth herself never explained to anyone. The servants who cleared her table each night, however, carrying away what remained after she had risen and left the room, learned over time to read those uneaten dishes the way you might read a letter. What was gone told you she had been hungry, that her appetite had been genuine, that whatever had occupied her mind and body throughout the day had left her with enough ease and enough ordinary human need to sit down and actually eat. What remained told you something too, if you knew how to look. And these women, the ones who cleared the table and carried the plates back toward the kitchens through the same corridors and past the same guards and down the same worn stone paths, they knew how to look. They had been looking for years. And what they saw, night after night, was a portrait of Elizabeth Tudor that no painter ever captured and no historian ever fully recovered. A portrait made not of pigment and canvas, but of breadcrumbs and empty dishes and wine cups drained or left untouched, telling its own quiet, intimate, endlessly human story about a woman the rest of the world saw only from a very great distance. The door opens finally, and Elizabeth enters without ceremony. At least, not the kind of ceremony that visitors from foreign courts would have recognized, not the elaborate procession of gentlemen ushers and heralds that preceded her entrance into a great hall on a banquet night. Here, among women she trusts, she moves more simply. She has already been dressed for the evening, of course. Her gown is settled, her jewels are in place, her hair arranged in whatever style the demands of the day and the skill of the women who attended her had produced, because a queen did not undress for dinner the way we might slip into something comfortable at the end of a long day. The clothing remained. The formality of appearance remained. You did not simply change out of being a queen when the working day ended, because the working day never entirely ended, and the clothing was part of the armor that kept the world at a distance even in moments that appeared, from the outside, to be private and relaxed. But something in her posture loosens slightly the moment the door closes behind her. She sits. The lady standing nearest pours wine, cut with water in the proportion Elizabeth prefers, and sets the cup within easy reach without being asked. This is the choreography of long familiarity, the kind that develops between a person and those who have spent years anticipating her needs before she has to voice them. No words are exchanged for this particular transaction. None are necessary. The wine appears because it always appears, poured in exactly the right way because it is always poured in exactly the right way, placed precisely where Elizabeth's hand will find it without reaching, because it is always placed precisely there. The seamlessness of it is the whole point. A queen should never have to ask for anything so basic as a cup of wine at her own table. The asking would imply a failure of attention on someone else's part, and failures of attention, however small, were simply not tolerated in this particular corner of the household. Elizabeth reaches first tonight for the bread. She breaks a small piece from the manchet loaf, the pale, fine-textured version reserved for her table alone, and eats it slowly, without hurry, while glancing at the other dishes arranged before her without any particular urgency. There is no rush in this room. Whatever crisis or negotiation or piece of unwelcome news had occupied her hours earlier has been left, for the moment, outside that closed door. And this is where we leave Elizabeth tonight, for the moment, reaching for bread in a room full of candlelight, surrounded by an abundance she will barely touch and a silence she has earned through a day of being anything but silent. The kitchens below are finally beginning to quiet. The boy at the spit has been relieved by someone older and is somewhere in the servants' quarters, rubbing his aching arm and thinking about nothing in particular. The woman with the spicery key has locked the door and pocketed the key and gone to find her own supper. The taster has performed his last nod of the evening and stepped back into the comfortable anonymity of a role that asks him to be constantly present and perpetually invisible. The whole vast machinery of feeding a queen has completed its daily cycle, from the first fires lit in the dark before dawn to this quiet, candlelit room where a woman sits alone with her bread and her wine and her thoughts, and tomorrow it will begin again. Every part of it, every fire, every loaf, every careful measurement of cinnamon and sugar, every covered dish carried through the same worn corridors by the same quiet footsteps, converging once more on this table, this chair, this woman, who will once again taste a little of what is offered and leave the rest, and whose private appetite, so modest and so human and so utterly at odds with the vast machinery built to serve it, will remain one of the least recorded and most genuinely fascinating details of one of the most thoroughly documented reigns in English history. Elizabeth reaches first tonight for the bread. She breaks a small piece from the manchet loaf, the pale fine-textured version reserved for her table alone, and eats it slowly while glancing at the other dishes without any particular urgency. There is no rush in this room. Whatever crisis or negotiation had occupied her hours earlier has been left for the moment outside the door. The lady standing nearest watches without appearing to watch, a skill refined over years until it has become as natural as breathing, and she notes that the queen's fingers move with a careful economy that suggests the day has already taken more from her than she will ever admit aloud. Candlelight catches the edge of the silver cup and throws a soft oval of brightness across the linen. The fire in the grate settles with a low sigh of collapsing embers. Outside these walls the palace continues its endless quiet machinery of guards changing posts and messengers waiting in corridors and officers reviewing ledgers by the last of the daylight. But in here the world has narrowed to the width of one table and the simple human act of a woman deciding what she will put in her mouth. I want to spend a little time here on what an ordinary private meal might actually have contained, because the specifics matter more than any general description could. Meat was always present, prepared in relatively simple ways for private dining compared with the elaborate presentations reserved for banquets. Perhaps a portion of mutton or veal roasted plainly, or a small dish of fowl whose skin had been crisped carefully over the same fires we watched earlier in the night. The meat arrived already carved into thin slices so that Elizabeth would never have to struggle with a joint in front of even her most trusted ladies. Fish appeared regularly too, particularly on the many days across the year when religious custom required abstaining from meat, and we will spend real time on those fasting days shortly because they shaped the rhythm of the entire kitchen in ways that might surprise you. Vegetables, when they appeared at all on a table of this rank, tended to be treated almost as an afterthought, a small side dish rather than the centerpiece, since vegetables carried associations in this period with the diets of the poor. A wealthy table signaled itself instead through meat, through sugar, through spice, through sheer visible abundance rather than through what we would now think of as nutritional balance. Sweets came at the end or sometimes scattered throughout, since Elizabethan dining did not follow the strict course structure that would develop in later centuries. Tonight it is the stewed pears from the spicery, softened in sugar and a little cinnamon, and Elizabeth reaches for these with what her lady, watching quietly, recognizes as genuine pleasure. Not performance. Not the practiced graciousness she might show at a public feast when accepting a dish because refusing it would offend the person who offered it. Something closer to simple appetite, the kind any of us might feel reaching for a favorite comfort at the end of a difficult day. Maybe her lady is someone who has learned over years of quiet observation that this is when Elizabeth is most herself. Not the queen depicted on coins and in formal portraits, upright and untouchable, but a woman in her 50s by this point in her reign, tired in the particular way that comes from carrying enormous responsibility without ever being allowed to set it down, finding a small measure of comfort in stewed fruit and warm bread and the company of people she does not have to perform for. The pears have been cooked until they yield at the slightest pressure of a spoon. The syrup around them catches the candlelight like liquid amber. Elizabeth takes a second portion, which her lady notes with the same careful attention she would give to a shift in the queen's breathing or a change in the set of her shoulders. These details accumulate. They become a private map of a person the rest of England only ever saw from a great distance. We should talk about her teeth briefly because it comes up so often when people discuss Elizabeth's diet, and I want to handle it gently and honestly rather than sensationally. Several visitors and observers over the course of her later reign did note in passing that her teeth had darkened and that some had been lost, and many historians reasonably connect this, at least in part, to a genuine lifelong fondness for sugar in a period before anyone understood dental hygiene the way we do now. Sugar was not brushed away. It sat against the teeth after every sweetmeat, and every candied fruit, and every sugared wafer. Over decades, the damage accumulated the same way it would in any person who consumed large quantities of sugar without the protections we take for granted. It is a small human detail, and I think it deserves to be treated as exactly that. Not a scandal, not a joke, just a quiet piece of evidence that even a queen was, underneath the crown and the portraits and the carefully constructed image of ageless magnificence, a person whose body responded to the choices available to her the same way any of ours would. The women who served her closest would have noticed the careful way she sometimes chewed, the dishes she approached more cautiously as the years advanced, the increasing preference for softer foods that did not demand as much from teeth that had already given long service. None of this was written down in any official capacity. It lived in the same unspoken archive of observation that recorded which wine she preferred and how she liked her bread positioned, and whether she had slept well the night before. Let us step back from the table for a moment and talk about time, because the calendar shaped what appeared on Elizabeth's plate almost as much as her own personal taste did. England under Elizabeth remained, at least officially, bound by a rhythm of fasting days inherited from centuries of religious practice, even as the country's religious identity itself had shifted considerably during her reign and her father's before her. Fridays, Saturdays, the whole extended season of Lent leading up to Easter, and a scattering of other observed days throughout the year all required abstaining from meat. On these days, the royal kitchens simply reorganized themselves around fish instead. This was not a small adjustment. A kitchen that spent most of its energy roasting beef and mutton and preparing elaborate meat pies had to pivot on fasting days toward an entirely different set of skills and ingredients. Fresh fish when it could be had, carried in from coastal suppliers or from rivers and ponds kept specifically for this purpose. Salted and preserved fish when fresh was not available, soaked for hours to draw out some of the harsh saltiness before cooking. Eels, which were genuinely common and well regarded at this point in English history in a way that might surprise a modern listener. Oysters, plentiful and comparatively inexpensive along much of the English coast, appearing on tables far more often than they would centuries later once over-harvesting made them a luxury. A cook working the fish course on a Friday in this kitchen has an entirely different set of problems than her colleague working meat the rest of the week. Fish prepared badly announces itself immediately in a way that a well-seasoned roast can sometimes forgive. She works with a light hand, a little butter, a little of the same imported spice that flavors so much else in this kitchen, and produces a dish that on the queen's table that evening will sit alongside bread and stewed fruit in place of the meat that would ordinarily anchor the meal. There is something worth noticing in how seriously this rhythm was maintained, even at the highest level of the household. Even for a queen whose own religious position had been across her lifetime complicated and occasionally dangerous to hold. Fasting days were not merely private religious observance. They were a public signal, visible in what left the kitchen and what did not, that the crown continued to honor a structure of religious life that stretched back long before Elizabeth or her father had ever worn it. The servants understood this without needing it explained. On a fasting day, the entire character of the kitchen changed. The great roasting spits stood idle or were used for fish instead. The smell in the corridors shifted from the rich, heavy scent of roasting beef to something cleaner and sharper, the mineral tang of oysters, the oilier fragrance of salmon or pike, the distinctive aroma of eels simmering in a broth scented with herbs. Elizabeth herself observed these days with the same outward consistency she brought to most matters of public religious performance, though what she privately believed about the spiritual necessity of abstaining from meat is something no surviving source allows us to know with certainty. What we can know is that the kitchen never failed to make the adjustment, and that the dishes arriving at her table on a Friday looked and tasted entirely different from the dishes that arrived on a Tuesday, and that this difference was itself a form of continuity with a much older England that her own religious settlement had in many other ways transformed. And then there were the feast days, scattered through the calendar like small bright counterweights to all that restraint. Christmas, Easter, once Lent had finally ended. Certain saints' days still observed with particular foods attached to them by tradition, too old and too beloved to fully abandon. On these days the kitchen's ordinary abundance multiplied even further, and dishes appeared that simply did not exist on an ordinary Tuesday. Elaborate pies shaped and decorated for the occasion. Roasted meats in far greater variety. Sweets and spiced wine, and all the visual theater that a great feast required. Maybe you are already noticing a pattern here, because I think it is one of the more human threads running through this entire story. Elizabeth's calendar, like anyone's, moved between restraint and abundance, between plainer days and richer ones, between the quiet private meal we just watched her eat and the grand public spectacle we are about to walk through together. The rhythm feels in its own way oddly familiar. We all live inside some version of that same pattern, even now, even without a crown. The body still responds to seasons of holding back and seasons of letting go. The difference is that for Elizabeth, every one of those seasons was also a political statement, observed by an entire court and reported outward by ambassadors whose letters could shape how foreign kingdoms understood the health and stability of English power. Now let us slow down here for a moment and talk about the other kind of meal entirely. The kind Elizabeth ate not among a handful of trusted ladies, but in front of the entire watching world. Public dining in Elizabeth's court was never really about eating at all. It was theater, carefully staged, and everyone involved understood the performance even if they rarely said so out loud. Picture a great hall, considerably larger than the intimate rooms we have been sitting in tonight, hung with tapestries that had taken skilled weavers years to complete, lit by more candles than most English households would burn in a month. Long tables run the length of the room, filled with courtiers, ambassadors, favored guests, all dressed in fabrics chosen specifically to be seen. And at the far end, on a raised platform beneath a canopy of state, sits Elizabeth's own table, positioned so that everyone in the room can watch her without appearing to stare. And they do watch. That is rather the point. Every gesture becomes information. Every dish she accepts or declines becomes a data point in the endless informal intelligence gathering that surrounded any Renaissance monarch. An ambassador, noting that the English queen ate heartily tonight, might report home that she appeared in good health and high spirits. An ambassador, noting that she barely touched her food, might set in motion a chain of speculation about illness or melancholy or political anxiety that could affect negotiations for months. The food arriving at a banquet like this bears almost no resemblance to the modest, comfortable dishes we saw earlier tonight in her private rooms. Here presentation mattered as much as flavor, sometimes more. Elaborate pies constructed to resemble castles or ships. Sugar sculptures worked by hand into fantastic shapes. animals and heraldic symbols and miniature landscapes, entirely edible and entirely intended to be admired before they were, if they were, eventually eaten. Whole roasted birds were dressed in their own feathers after cooking, arranged to look startlingly alive on the platter, a practice that seems almost macabre to modern sensibilities, but which signaled to contemporary eyes a level of culinary sophistication and resource that few households could match. This was food as spectacle, food as a demonstration of wealth and taste, and the sheer organizational power required to produce something this elaborate on a single evening. A servant carrying one of these sculpted sugar centerpieces through the hall walks with particular care, aware that a single misstep could destroy hours of a confectioner's work in an instant, and aware too that every eye in the room is following the dish's progress toward the high table. There is a kind of pressure in that walk that has nothing to do with the weight of what he carries and everything to do with the knowledge that he is, for these few moments, a visible part of the performance. Elizabeth, seated beneath her canopy, ate very little at these grand public meals by most surviving accounts. And this is worth sitting with because it tells us something rather sharp about the gap between the meal as spectacle and the meal as sustenance. She was watched constantly. Every gesture, every dish she accepted or declined, every moment of visible enjoyment or visible restraint would be noted, discussed, carried outward by ambassadors into letters sent to foreign courts describing the English queen's health, her mood, her apparent favor toward this dish or that guest. Eating in public, for Elizabeth, was never simply eating. It was diplomacy conducted one small bite at a time. Let us follow one of those servants now, because I think her perspective might be the most interesting one in this entire story. Maybe she is a woman who began her service in the royal household as a girl barely into her teens, learning first the simplest tasks, carrying, fetching, standing quietly against a wall for hours at a time, until her legs ached and her presence became so familiar that the room around her stopped noticing she was there at all. That particular kind of invisibility, earned over years, is its own strange privilege. It meant she saw things. She saw Elizabeth laugh once at something a lady said quietly near the fire, a real laugh, unguarded, nothing like the practiced smile shown to foreign envoys. She saw the queen push a dish of overly rich meat aside, without comment on an evening when her stomach was clearly troubling her, and saw the kitchen quietly adjust the following day's offerings without anyone above stairs ever issuing a formal instruction to do so. She saw more than once Elizabeth eat almost nothing at all during a public feast, and then hours later, in the privacy of her own rooms, finally eat properly, hungrily, the way anyone might after holding themselves carefully together in front of an audience all evening. None of this made its way into official records. There was no reason for it to, but it lived quietly in the memory of the women who served her closest, passed along sometimes in the smallest of comments to a newer servant learning the household's unspoken rules. This is what she prefers when she is tired. This is what she cannot abide when her stomach is unsettled. This is the dish to bring when nothing else has tempted her all day. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a great hall after a banquet has ended and the guests have finally drifted away toward their own beds. And it is a quiet almost nobody outside the household ever witnesses. Long tables that had only an hour earlier groaned under sculpted sugar and roasted birds and towers of pastry now sit half cleared. Candles burned down to stubs. Wine stains soaking slowly into linen that servants have not yet had time to gather. And here is something that genuinely surprises people when they hear it for the first time. A staggering amount of food from an occasion like this simply went uneaten. Not a plate here or there. Entire dishes barely touched. Elaborate constructions that had taken a confectioner the better part of a day to build, now sitting cold and abandoned, because presentation, not consumption, had been the point all along. What happened to it depended a great deal on what it was. Some food, still perfectly good, made its way down through the household hierarchy, feeding the lower servants who had spent the entire evening on their feet carrying trays to other people's tables. Almoners in wealthy households of this era were traditionally responsible for distributing surplus food to the poor gathered at the gates, a practice with genuinely old roots in English custom. Though how consistently this happened at the royal level by Elizabeth's reign is something historians reconstruct carefully rather than state with total certainty. Other dishes, the ones already picked over, already cooling into something considerably less appetizing than they had been an hour earlier, were simply discarded. And a small crew of servants moved through the emptying hall in the deep hours of the night, clearing plate, gathering linen, sweeping away the debris of a spectacle that had already served its purpose the moment the last guest turned to admire it. Maybe she is one of those servants, moving through the hall with a basket at her hip, gathering half-eaten sweetmeats into it without much sentiment, because she has done this often enough that the strangeness of it, wealth thrown carelessly aside, has long since worn off. She works quickly, quietly, aware that the sooner this hall is cleared, the sooner she can find her own bed, and aware, too, in some part of her mind, she rarely examines closely, that the food she is discarding tonight would have fed her entire family for a week back in the village she came from. There is no bitterness in this observation, particularly. It is simply the shape of the world she lives in, understood the way you understand weather, something to work around rather than something to rage against. The sugar sculptures that looked so magnificent under the blaze of 100 candles look sadder now in the dim light of a few remaining stubs, their edges softening, their painted details beginning to blur. She breaks them down efficiently, separating what can still be used from what cannot, and moves on. By the time the sun rises, this hall will be empty and clean and ready for whatever the next day demands. And the memory of tonight's spectacle will already be fading into the long succession of identical spectacles that stretch behind and ahead of this one like rooms in an endless corridor. Let us go back further still, past the kitchens, past even the palace walls, to where all of this actually began. Feeding a royal household on this scale required a supply chain that reached out across a considerable stretch of English countryside, and much of it began at first light in markets and orchards and gardens tended specifically for this purpose. Certain estates near the palace maintained kitchen gardens whose entire output was designated for the royal table, tended by gardeners who understood exactly which vegetables and herbs the head cook expected delivered on which mornings. Orchards supplied apples and pears, and when the season allowed, the more delicate stone fruits that needed to travel quickly before they spoiled. Fishmongers with contracts to supply the royal household rose before dawn to secure the freshest catch, aware that fish delivered even a few hours late might be rejected outright by a kitchen with no patience for anything less than excellent. A cart rattling toward the palace gates in the gray light of early morning might carry baskets of early peas, bundles of herbs still damp with dew, a crate of live poultry destined to be dispatched and dressed within the hour. The driver knows this route well, has driven it more mornings than he could easily count, and barely glances at the palace walls rising ahead of him anymore, though there was a time, years back, when the sight of them still gave him a small thrill of pride. Delivering food that would end up, however indirectly, on the Queen's own table felt like a connection to something larger than his own ordinary life. That feeling has faded with repetition, as most feelings do, but it has not disappeared entirely. Some mornings, when the light hits the walls a certain way and the air smells of wet grass and wood smoke, he remembers it. I think there is something worth noticing in just how many hands touched a single meal before it ever reached Elizabeth. The gardener who grew the peas, the driver who carried them, the kitchen boy who shelled them, the cook who prepared them, the taster who sampled them, the lady who served them. An entire quiet chain of ordinary people, most of whom Elizabeth never met and never would, all working in concert to produce a single evening's dinner that she might, in the end, barely touch. Each person in that chain performed their part without any real knowledge of the others, connected only by the food itself as it moved from soil to cart to kitchen to table. And when Elizabeth finally lifted a spoonful of those peas to her mouth, or more likely pushed them aside in favor of the stewed pears, she was in a very real sense the final link in a sequence of labor that had begun before she was even awake. The peas did not know they were destined for a queen. The gardener did not know whether they would be eaten or discarded. The system simply continued, day after day, season after season, producing abundance around a woman whose actual consumption remained stubbornly, mysteriously modest. Let us move forward now into the particular rhythm of an ordinary day, because the meals themselves followed a structure that shaped the entire palace's schedule around them. Breakfast in Elizabeth's household was a considerably lighter affair than the meals we have spent most of tonight exploring, And this itself tells us something about how Tudor England understood the day's first meal compared with how we might think of breakfast now. For most of the household, breakfast meant bread, perhaps some cold meat left from the previous day, and ale, consumed relatively quickly before the working day properly began. For Elizabeth herself, breakfast tended to be modest, sometimes barely more than bread and a small portion of meat or fish, taken quietly, often while she was already occupied with correspondence or with the first audiences of the morning. A lady bringing in this small breakfast tray in the gray early hours of the morning has learned that Elizabeth rarely lingers over it. The Queen's mind by this hour is usually already elsewhere, on letters that need answering, on a council meeting scheduled for later, on some diplomatic matter that has kept her awake half the night turning it over. Food at breakfast is fuel rather than pleasure, something to be managed quickly so the real work of the day can begin. This is worth pausing on, I think, because it stands in such contrast to the evening meal we watched earlier, the one where Elizabeth reached for stewed pears with what her lady recognized as genuine, unguarded pleasure. Morning Elizabeth and evening Elizabeth were not quite the same woman, at least not as her household experienced her. Morning brought the weight of the day ahead, sharp and immediate. Evening brought, if she was fortunate, a little space to simply exist for an hour or two before sleep. The women who served her in both settings understood this shift without needing it named. They adjusted their own behavior accordingly, more brisk and efficient in the morning hours, more attuned to comfort and quiet in the evening ones. Between breakfast and the grander midday meal, there was often a smaller pause, a moment where wine or a little bread might be brought to wherever Elizabeth happened to be working. And it is here, in these smaller unofficial moments, that cordials and medicinal preparations most often appeared. This is worth its own attention because food and medicine were not nearly as separate in this period as we tend to think of them now. A still room maintained by someone in the household with particular skill in this area produced waters and cordials distilled from herbs and flowers believed to settle the stomach, calm the nerves, or ease the particular aches and fatigues that came with age and overwork. Rose water, cordials flavored with mint or with the small hoard of citrus that had traveled such a long way to reach the palace. A warm posset, milk curdled gently with wine or ale and sweetened with sugar, offered on evenings when Elizabeth's stomach seemed unsettled or when sleep had been difficult to find the night before. Maybe she is the woman responsible for this particular corner of the household's work, quietly respected for a skill that sat somewhere between cooking and medicine, trusted with preparations that would be given directly to the Queen without the elaborate tasting rituals applied to ordinary dishes, because these smaller remedies came from hands already known and already trusted absolutely. I find something quietly moving in this too. Even a queen, even a woman who commanded the resources of an entire kingdom, still reached in the end for the same things any of us might reach for on a difficult night. Something warm, something sweet, something familiar, prepared by someone who knew her well enough to get it exactly right without being told. Let us turn now to the meal that actually anchored the middle of the day, the one the household simply called dinner, taken sometime around midday and considerably more substantial than the light breakfast that preceded it. Dinner taken at midday was where the household's culinary ambition truly showed itself, even on days with no guests, no ambassadors, nothing to perform for beyond the ordinary maintenance of royal dignity. This was the meal with the most dishes, the most variety, the clearest demonstration of everything those kitchens we walked through earlier had been preparing since before dawn. The service of this meal followed its own careful choreography, one that had almost nothing to do with simply carrying food from kitchen to table. Gentlemen ushers, men of relatively high status within the household hierarchy, oversaw the physical procession of dishes into the dining chamber, walking ahead of the servers carrying the actual food, their presence announcing that something important was approaching before a single plate had come into view. This mattered enormously in a world built almost entirely on visible hierarchy. The person who carried your food, the person who announced its arrival, the order in which dishes reached the table, all of it communicated status as clearly as any spoken word could have. A gentleman usher walking this route on an ordinary Tuesday might feel, if he is honest, a small private satisfaction in the formality of it, the sense of participating in something that connected him, however distantly, to centuries of English royal tradition. He does not carry the food himself. That work belongs to servers of somewhat lower rank. But his presence at the head of the procession is not decorative. It signals to anyone watching that what follows deserves attention and respect. The table itself, by the time everything arrived, would hold considerably more dishes than any single person could reasonably eat, even someone with a heartier appetite than Elizabeth generally displayed. Meat prepared several different ways, perhaps a roast alongside something stewed or baked into a pie. Fish if the day called for it. Bread in its various grades. A selection of the season's vegetables, arranged more for visual balance than out of any real expectation that they would be eaten in quantity. And always, somewhere on the table, something sweet, whether stewed fruit or a small dish of sugared nuts or a delicate custard flavored with the spices, kept so carefully locked away in that small room off the kitchen. Elizabeth's own consumption from this abundance remained, by most accounts, restrained. A portion here, a taste there. Attention paid more to conversation, to the ladies and occasional guests seated near her, than to systematically working through the dishes laid before her. This was, in its own way, a form of power too. The ability to be surrounded by more food than you could possibly want, and to simply not want it, said something about a person's position in the world that scarcity never could. Table linens for a meal like this were changed and laundered with a care that modern households rarely apply to anything. The finest cloth reserved entirely for the Queen's own table, bleached through careful and repeated washing until it achieved a whiteness that servants down the hierarchy simply never saw on their own more modest linens. A single knife sat beside Elizabeth's place, its handle sometimes decorated, its blade kept honed by someone whose entire job in part involved making sure the Queen's cutlery never embarrassed the household through carelessness. Fingers did the rest of the work that a knife could not, dipped afterward into a small bowl of water scented lightly with herbs, then dried on a napkin held ready by an attentive lady standing near enough to anticipate the need before it was voiced. I want to pause on that detail for a moment. The bowl of scented water, because it is such a small thing, and yet it tells you so much about how thoroughly this world had been organized around anticipating a single person's comfort. Someone somewhere in the household had decided which herbs should scent that water. Someone changed it fresh for every meal. Someone made absolutely certain it was warm rather than cold, because a queen should never have to notice that the water was too cold to be pleasant. This is what extraordinary privilege actually looks like up close. Not one grand gesture, but hundreds of tiny, carefully maintained comforts, so consistent and so seamless that the person receiving them might barely register they were being given at all. Let us talk about the seasons for a while, because nothing shaped a Tudor kitchen more completely than the simple, unavoidable fact that most food could not be had year-round. Summer, the season we opened in tonight, brought its own particular abundance. Soft fruits ripening quickly and needing to be used almost as fast as they arrived. Strawberries and cherries and the first plums, none of which could be reliably stored for more than a few days without spoiling. Fresh peas and beans from the kitchen gardens, tender and sweet in a way that would fade entirely once the season turned. Herbs at their most fragrant, cut fresh each morning rather than relying on the dried stores kept for winter use. The kitchens in summer ran on a kind of controlled urgency, everything arriving at peak ripeness and needing to be transformed into something that would keep, or served immediately before the heat of the day began to tell on ingredients that had no patience for delay. Winter told an entirely different story, and a cook working the royal kitchens in January faced a set of constraints that summer never demanded. Fresh vegetables largely disappeared, replaced by whatever had been carefully stored through the autumn. Root vegetables kept in cool, dry cellars. Cabbages that could hold through the cold months if handled correctly. Meat, ironically, became somewhat easier to manage in winter since cold temperatures slowed spoilage naturally in a way summer heat never allowed. And this is part of why so much livestock was traditionally slaughtered in late autumn, producing salted and preserved meat meant to carry a household through the leanest months. Preserved fruit, the kind we saw earlier sitting in ceramic jars deep in the palace cellars, became considerably more important once winter set in and fresh fruit simply was not available at any price. Dried fruit too, figs and raisins and currants, most of it imported, expensive, and treated with the same careful accounting applied to sugar and spice. A kitchen that had run generously through summer's natural abundance had to plan months ahead for a winter table that would need to feel nearly as rich despite having so much less fresh material to work with. Maybe she is a cook who has spent years learning exactly how to stretch a winter pantry convincingly, how to use spice and sugar and clever presentation to make a dish built from stored preserved ingredients feel every bit as impressive as something built from fresh summer produce. This is its own quiet skill, rarely celebrated, though it mattered enormously to a household that could not simply admit in the middle of February that the Queen's table looked a little thinner than it had in July. There is something almost architectural about how carefully this seasonal rhythm had to be planned. Nothing in this kitchen happened by accident. Every jar of preserved fruit, every side of salted meat, every careful decision about which vegetables could survive storage and which could not, represented weeks or months of foresight executed by people whose names history mostly never bothered to record. Now let us return for a while to the quieter hours, because I want to tell you about supper, the meal that closed the day, considerably lighter than the grand midday dinner we just walked through together. Supper arrived in the early evening, lighter than dinner, closer in spirit to the small private meal we watched Elizabeth take earlier tonight, though not always quite as intimate depending on who happened to be at court and what the day had demanded of her. A typical supper might include some of the same dishes carried over from dinner, reheated or simply presented again, alongside something freshly prepared, perhaps a light dish of eggs or more of that stewed fruit the kitchen kept returning to throughout the day because Elizabeth's fondness for it was so well understood by everyone responsible for feeding her. Bread, always bread in its careful grades, wine cut with water, and often by this hour a growing sense throughout the palace that the day's formal obligations were finally beginning to loosen their grip. For the servants who had been working since before dawn, supper marked something different entirely. A meal taken much further down the household hierarchy, in kitchens and servants' halls rather than gilded private chambers, eaten quickly and without much ceremony before the evening's remaining work began. The kitchen boy who had turned that spit of beef so many hours earlier finally gets his own meal now. Coarser bread, a portion of ale, whatever meat or pottage the kitchen has set aside for the staff, who kept the entire elaborate machine running all day. He eats standing mostly, or perched on an overturned crate near the fire that has finally, mercifully, begun to cool. There is a kind of fairness in this, and a kind of unfairness too, both true at once. Every person in this palace eats tonight, from the queen in her private chamber down to the youngest kitchen boy resting his aching arm near the fire. But the distance between what fills each of their plates, in quality, in variety, in sheer luxury, remains enormous, and everyone involved understands this distance as simply the shape of the world they were born into, rarely questioned aloud, rarely even resented in any way that made its way into the historical record. As the light outside, maybe she is watching Elizabeth now in this final quiet hour and thinking, as she sometimes does, about how strange it is to know someone this intimately and yet not know her at all. She knows exactly how Elizabeth likes her wine poured. She does not know what actually occupies the Queen's mind in these quiet moments. What worries trail behind her into sleep. What she truly thinks about the enormous weight she carries every single day of her reign. That distance, that particular kind of closeness without true intimacy, is perhaps the strangest part of serving a monarch this closely. You see everything and understand almost nothing. Late that night, after Elizabeth has finally retired, a small crew of servants moves quietly through her private dining room, clearing away what remains of the evening. This is, in its own way, the most revealing moment of the entire day, though almost nobody outside this small circle ever thought to consider it that way. What was gone told its own story. The bread mostly finished, the stewed pears entirely gone, the dish scraped nearly clean, which told the lady clearing it that Elizabeth's appetite tonight had been genuine, unforced, the kind that comes when a person actually wants what is in front of them rather than simply performing the motions of dining. The meat, though, sits largely untouched, only a few bites taken from what had been a generous portion. And this too tells its own quiet story, though its meaning is harder to read with any certainty. Perhaps she simply preferred the sweeter dish tonight. Perhaps her stomach had been unsettled. Perhaps the meat itself had not been prepared quite to her liking. Though no complaint had been voiced, because complaints were rarely necessary in a household organized this carefully around anticipating preference before it needed to be spoken aloud. The servants clearing this table do not discuss what they observe. Not really. Not in any formal way. But knowledge like this accumulates quietly over months and years, passed along almost by osmosis from one experienced servant to the next, until an entire unofficial understanding of the Queen's preferences exists nowhere written down, held instead in the collective memory of the small circle of people who prepared and served and cleared her private meals. I find myself genuinely moved by this. Honestly, there is no official record anywhere describing Elizabeth's private appetite in the kind of intimate detail her servants carried in their own memories. The formal historical record gives us treaties and speeches and the grand performance of a monarch who ruled for decades with extraordinary skill. It does not tell us, not really, that she scraped a dish of stewed pears clean on a warm evening in the summer of 1590 while barely touching the meat beside it. That detail lived and mostly died with the women who watched her eat. And yet it is in details like this, fragile and unrecorded and deeply human, that the past sometimes feels closest, as if the centuries separating us from that candlelit room have thinned to something you could almost reach through, if you only knew how to look. Winter arrives differently inside a palace than it does on the open road. The same kitchens that rang with the bright urgency of summer fruit now settle into a deeper, slower heat. Fires burn just as constantly, perhaps more so, because warmth in these vast stone rooms matters as much for comfort as for cooking. Carts still roll to the gates at first light, but their loads have changed. No baskets of peas still beaded with dew. No towers of soft berries that must be used before noon. Instead come roots pulled from cold storage, cabbages that have held their firmness through the frosts, salted meat brought up from the cellars, and whatever jars of preserved fruit remain from the autumn's careful work. A cook who has stood over these hearths for years now moves with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned to coax richness from scarcity. She thickens a pottage with barley, softens salted pork that has soaked overnight, and reaches for the same locked spices that once scented summer pears. The dish that leaves her station will never look like the sugar castles of a banquet night, yet it carries its own hard-won grace. Flavor drawn from patience rather than plenty. Elizabeth's winter table reflects the shift without ever admitting deprivation. Preserved fruit takes the place of fresh, spiced, and sweetened until the transition feels almost intentional. Fresh game, when the huntsmen succeed, arrives as a small celebration. Sugar, that costly white gold, becomes if anything more prominent, because sweetness is one luxury the cold cannot diminish. By this season of her reign she is older. Those who serve her closest notice the changes the way one notices the slow alteration of light across a year. Her appetite, never large, grows more particular. Dishes that once pleased her now sit untouched more often. Digestive troubles, hinted at rather than described in the surviving scraps of record, mean the still room cordials and warm possets take on a more openly medicinal purpose. A lady who has known her since both were younger watches these adjustments with a tenderness that never names itself as worry. She simply removes one dish from the rotation, keeps another cordial always ready, and makes certain every plate arrives truly hot, because an aging body feels the cold in ways a younger one forgets. Power does not spare anyone the ordinary truths of flesh. The woman who faced down armadas and outmaneuvered half the princes of Europe still grows tired. Still loses her appetite, still needs, on certain nights, nothing more complicated than something warm and sweet placed quietly at her elbow by a person who has learned her rhythms better than any physician. In a room set apart from the roaring heat of the main kitchens, a confectioner works sugar the way a sculptor works stone. It does not arrive as the soft crystals we know. It comes in hard, dense cones that must be broken with iron tools, then ground and worked by hand. For ordinary sweetening the labor is already considerable. For the great centerpieces of a banquet it becomes art. Marchpane, that fine paste of ground almonds and sugar, can be shaped almost like clay. A skilled hand can press it into molds, build towers and beasts and heraldic devices, then paint them with colors safe to eat. One woman, who trained for years under a master before earning the right to create pieces for the Queen's own table, may spend an entire day on a single sculpture. She knows it may be admired for only a few minutes before a knife cuts into it, or before it is left almost untouched because spectacle, not hunger, was the point. Still, she works with total concentration. Pride of this kind asks no audience. Every finished castle or swan is a small edible proof that the household commands resources and skill enough to turn sand like sugar into wonder. Ambassadors will remember it. Letters will carry the memory across seas. In that sense, the confectioner's quiet labor is diplomacy conducted in sweetness and almonds. New flavor. The women who stand closest to Elizabeth during her private meals occupy a position unlike any other at court. Many come from noble families. They are not servants in the ordinary sense. Yet within these rooms they pour the wine, advance the dishes, read the queen's mood, and perform the thousand small anticipations that keep a private dinner frictionless. A young woman sent by ambitious parents quickly learns that survival depends less on grand gestures than on accumulated grace. How steadily she pours, whether she remembers the cup is preferred only half full, whether she knows when conversation is welcome and when silence is kinder. Friendships form in that closeness. So do quieter rivalries. Favor is measured in inches and glances. A lady who consistently anticipates correctly gains a subtle standing among her peers. One who falters finds herself, without any harsh word, moved a little further from the center. No written list of rules exists. Knowledge passes by watching, by small corrections, by the long memory of those who have served longest. Every meal becomes a miniature theater of status played out in the placement of a cup or the offer of a dish. The objects themselves carry weight. By Elizabeth's day, the old bread trenchers have largely given way, at the highest level, to silver plate. On the greatest occasions, the vessels are gilded. A servant whose charge is the silver lives by the knowledge that one dull or spotted piece set before the queen reflects on the entire household. Hours of polishing precede every formal meal. When the food finally appears, plate, cup, and knife must gleam as though effort had never been required. Effortlessness is the highest luxury, and it is purchased with invisible labor. One evening, a foreign ambassador is expected. The relationship between his master and England sits in that delicate space between friendship and wary respect. Word reaches the kitchens early. This will not be an ordinary dinner. Dishes are chosen to speak of English wealth and English restraint in the same breath. The confectioner receives longer notice than usual. Her sugar work that night will be more ambitious, designed to travel home in the ambassador's memory and in the letter he will write. In the great hall, the seating is arranged with the precision of a diplomatic chessboard. Close enough to honor, not so close as to imply equality. When Elizabeth enters, she wears the full calculated grace that public life demands. Course after course is presented with theatrical care. The ambassador watches with a practiced eye. A lady standing near enough to catch his unguarded moments sees the brief genuine surprise when the sugar sculpture appears, the small hesitation before he tastes a dish more heavily spiced than his own court usually permits. Those tiny cracks in composure tell her more than any formal exchange. Beneath the entire performance, Elizabeth once again eats sparingly. Her attention is divided between real conversation and the exhausting knowledge that every gesture will be reported, weighed, and remembered in a foreign court for years. The man who tastes her food before she does has performed his office so long that the first sharp nervousness has settled into watchful routine. He has never yet found anything amiss. The absence of danger does not make the duty less real. It may mean the precaution itself has succeeded. Over the years, he has come to know her palate more intimately than almost anyone at court. He recognizes the exact balance of cinnamon in the stewed fruit she favors. He knows which dishes return again and again because she truly likes them. Yet in all that time, he has exchanged barely a handful of words with her. Intimacy and distance exist here in configurations that still feel strange. He places her supper in his own mouth, judges it safe, and remains, socially, a stranger. When illness comes, the kitchen's entire purpose narrows. Rich dishes vanish. Thin broths, barley water, simple foods offered in small amounts replace the usual abundance. A cook working through those days feels a different pressure. There is no spectacle to hide behind. The only question is what might ease her. That quieter cooking demands its own mastery. In summer, the court sometimes leaves the palace entirely. Royal progresses turn the problem of feeding the queen into a traveling ordeal for whichever noble household is honored and financially strained by her visit. Kitchens are enlarged, extra cooks hired, local specialties pressed into service. Some hosts never fully recover the cost. Elizabeth's own trusted servants travel with her, creating an uneasy collaboration between local ambition and royal preference. Sometimes the meeting of styles produces something genuinely pleasing that she later requests again. Sometimes the grandest local effort is quietly set aside in favor of the simpler dishes her own people know she will actually eat. Even on the road, surrounded by pageantry, what she wants remains consistent. Good bread, something sweet, meat without excessive fuss, the comforts her longest-serving people can recreate anywhere. Night in the palace is never wholly still. Watchmen move along corridors with small lanterns. In the kitchens, a single servant keeps the banked fires alive, so the morning need not begin from cold ash. In the cellars, the wine rests in darkness. Deep in the stone, a slow dripping continues that has sounded in that same place for centuries and will continue long after this rain ends. Upstairs, a lady sits awake longer than the others, listening until Elizabeth's breathing steadies into true sleep. Only then does her own vigilance soften. The arrangement looks extreme from outside. Even rest requires a watcher. Yet there is also something peaceful in it, the simple human willingness to remain nearby in case one is needed. Before any formal meal, water is brought for the washing of hands. The basin is fine, the water often lightly scented with rose or herbs, the cloth offered at precisely the right moment. Elizabeth washes first. The attendant who pours knows that a clumsy stream or a delayed cloth will be noticed. Precedence governs everything. Who sits, who stands, who is served in what order. The visible order of the realm is reenacted daily in the smallest gestures. A newcomer who missteps feels the weight of it, even if no one speaks a rebuke. The emotional labor of constant, accurate reading of hierarchy is never named as work, yet without it every meal would falter. Christmas gathers every skill the kitchens possess and multiplies it across nearly 12 days. The boar's head is carried in with ceremony and old carols. Game appears that is rare in ordinary months. Spiced wine replaces the lighter drinks of quieter evenings. The spicery is drawn upon more heavily than at any other time. On 12th night, a cake containing a hidden bean is served. Whoever finds it becomes the brief mock sovereign of the revels, licensed to a freedom that would be unthinkable on any other night. For a few hours, the rigid world allows itself a controlled inversion. Then the ordinary order reasserts itself like a tide. And so the long day ends as it began, with fire and silence. The ovens cool. The spicery key is returned to its keeper. The last crumbs are cleared from the private table. What was eaten and what was left once again form their mute record. Perhaps the pears are gone and the meat almost untouched. Perhaps a posset cup stands empty beside the bed. The women who know how to read these signs carry the knowledge with them into sleep. No chronicle will preserve it. Treaties and speeches will fill the histories. The scraped dish, the preferred crust of bread, the exact moment a tired woman reached for sweetness. These live only in the transient memory of those who stood nearest. Yet that is enough. The vast machinery of supply and skill and watchfulness existed so that one person could, for a few minutes each day, simply eat or choose not to eat, and in that choice remain human. Morning will come. The fires will be rebuilt. The same quiet chain of hands will begin again. For now, in the deepest hours, the palace holds its breath, and the story of how a queen was fed settles into the stones like warmth slowly leaving iron. The gap between the mountain of food prepared and the modest portion consumed remains what it always was. A space filled with unseen lives, ordinary devotion, and the stubborn, daily miracle of keeping one mortal body safe and sustained while it carried the weight of a kingdom. That is where we leave her, not on the throne, not beneath the canopy of state, but in the ordinary dark after the last candle is pinched out, a woman who ruled an age and still, like anyone, needed bread and sweetness and the chance to set both down when she had had enough.